Okay, wonderful. Everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming today to the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. We have, every year at COP, we have a Sustainable Agriculture of the Americas Pavilion. So welcome. We're so glad you came. And we are really trying to bring the voice of the Americas agriculture to the global conversation and to advocate for how agriculture can be part of the solution to the challenges we face, both to feed the world for food security, for nutrition, and also for solutions to climate change. So thank you to our partners, Nutrien and others, representatives from Canada Agriculture. We have Sophie Beecher here, who will be the moderator of this panel. So without further ado, again, welcome. After the panel's over, please mingle and have coffee. Welcome, Sophie.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and we have 3 panelists, amazing. So welcome to our session on elevating sustainability in agri-food supply chains through focused Scope 3 interventions. So I'm Sophie Beecher. I'm the Director General of Sustainable Development Policy at the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food in Canada. So we all know that the path to achieving net zero emissions and sustainable agriculture relies on, frankly, collective efforts to drive meaningful change. Without collaboration, we will never get there. So today we'll hear from speakers from around the world who have amazing examples of lessons and blueprints and pathways for sustainability and achieving food security through climate change agricultural solutions. The session will focus on the importance of collaboration to achieve transparent, credible, verified Scope 3 emission reductions. So the speakers will share their insights. We're going to cover the significance of science-based verified Scope 3 emissions accounting in agriculture. And we're going to go through 2 rounds of questions, so longer questions up front, a short question, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. So joining us on stage today, we have Michelle Nutting, Director, Ag and Environmental Sustainability at Nutrien. We have Katie Sullivan, Managing Director at the International Emissions Trading Association, and Marcelo Torres, farmer representative, very important, we are so happy that you arrived, and who is president of Aprecid. So to kick off our discussions, we probably need a little refresher on what Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are, and I will turn to Michelle to explain that to us.
Thanks very much, Sophie. So it's amazing that she's asking an agronomist to explain Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, but that's the nature of agriculture. We are bringing our agricultural science into greenhouse gas accounting. So to start with, greenhouse gas inventory accounting categorizes our emissions as either Scope 1, which are the direct emissions that occur as a result of your operations, so within your operational boundary. And then Scope 2 are indirect emissions that occur from the energy that you've purchased. So what were the emissions required to produce that electricity that you're purchasing and using in your operations? And then Scope 3 are indirect emissions that occur either upstream of your operational boundary or downstream of your operational footprint. They're emissions that you count in your inventory from, for example, goods that you purchase. We might be a purchaser of equipment or fertilizer, and they're also emissions that are associated with the products that you sell and what their use emissions are or their end-of-life phase emissions are. So it's really a way to just put clean boundaries and categorization that all of the corporates that have to report greenhouse gas inventories follow. It's a very standardized process.
So hopefully that's clear for everyone. And now, Michelle, I'm wondering if you can just give us also a refresher on the difference between offsetting and insetting.
Yeah, offsetting is a term that maybe not everybody likes to use, or insetting, pardon me. And so Let me just start by talking about insetting. So insetting is looking at your own supply chain and determining what emission reductions you can make within your supply chain boundary. So for a fertilizer company, insetting might mean that we're looking at working with an upstream provider of products, and we want them to provide us lower carbon emission products. Or we're looking downstream at the use of our products, so use of fertilizer in the field, and we're going to work with farm customers to reduce the emissions or increase the amount of removals associated with the use of our products in the field. But insetting very much occurs within your operational boundary, either upstream or downstream. Now, offsetting is the investment in an action that happens outside of your operational footprint. So a really good example of that might be a company like Microsoft purchasing forest credits. Microsoft has nothing to do with forestry, but they might want to invest in a forestry project, buy carbon credits, and offset those carbon credits against their own operational footprint. So the difference really is action with partners within your supply chain is an insetting project, and taking action outside of your operational boundary is offsetting.
Okay, that's very clear to me, at least. So to set up our panel conversation, I think it's important to mention that we've been talking about advanced soil and nutrient management practices to farmers for for a number of years, and also to the public as a path for increased revenue, resiliency for the farmers, and an opportunity to impact climate change. However, in the last 5 years, very few of the programs in the marketplace have achieved a verified and tradable carbon asset based on grower data. My understanding is that Nutrien has succeeded in that enterprise. And so, Michelle, if you can kick us off and tell us all about what were the challenges in establishing a Scope 3 pathway, and what has been Nutrien's experience in resolving some of these challenges?
Okay, great. So let me start with talking about the project that we undertook, which was very specific to looking at how do we support farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer use and increase the amount of soil carbon sequestered. And when we were new in this, I would say late 2019, we did what we called a portfolio approach, which means we looked at what does it take to create an offset in the agricultural market space on a carbon market like the Climate Action Reserve, and what does it take to create an inset, which is a supply chain project, and how do you do that credibly? And so offsetting is pretty clear. You work with existing bodies like the Climate Action Reserve or Vera, organizations that have both the quantification protocols as well as the registries. So that whole process walks you through kind of the principles of how to create credibly a robust quantification, how to follow the principles of carbon market accounting, and then you end up at the end of having validated and verified your method with that body, you end up with carbon credits on their registry, and those are available to sell. So we've done both. We've been with the Climate Action Reserve. We've followed a recognized protocol called the Nitrogen Management Protocol, and that laid out for us what was the quantification method, how was that following carbon principles, which are additional, permanent, real, transparent, not double counting. We followed that whole pathway, and we actually were able to create offsets on a registry that anybody could purchase, even though those occur in our supply chain. If we purchased them, we could count them. Then the second path that we took was with Sustained Cert. So Sustained Cert is a spin-off out of the gold standard, and Sustained Cert is leading something called the Value Chain Initiative, which is really supply chain projects. So interventions is the nomenclature that they like to use to describe a project where you work with supply chain partners and do the same thing as happens in the offset space. but it's a little bit more that you have to develop it with them as you go. So for our project, what we used as the basis was we used Canada's recognized protocols that were created in Alberta for nitrous oxide emission reduction, and we also looked at Canada's protocol on conservation cropping. And we wanted to start with recognized already available protocols in this voluntary carbon chain space, because that's the number one underpinning challenge, is having robust quantification that's underpinned by science and accepted in terms of what the impact is in terms of carbon emission reduction. So that was our step into the voluntary kind of carbon space in this value chain initiative. And then we have to create partnerships in this. So we worked with a company that is downstream from the farmer, a food company that was also interested in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the grain that they purchased from the farm. And I think that's one of the first challenges, is creating trusted, credible partnerships and having a shared North Star. So between ourselves and our downstream partner in the project, which was Maple Leaf Foods in Canada, we agreed that we had to aim high at those standards of robustness and quantification. We followed those market principles that the Value Chain Initiative has laid out and took that quantification methodology to them, where they had to take it to a, it's called a VVB, Validation and Verification Body. A third party has to look at the science that we use to quantify the emission reductions, and they have to look at all the accounting processes to make sure that we're dealing with the issues around permanence and additionality. They validate our pathway. They say, the way that you've laid out the process, that you've engaged with farms, that you've caused action to happen, that you've quantified the action, and now you are reporting that action within your own inventories, is a valid pathway. And once you get that third-party validation, then you can really scale your projects, because now you have the confidence that you're producing verified impacts. And for us, that North Star of credibility is, how do we count that in our greenhouse gas inventory? So having it assured or verified by SustainCert means that it's going to follow along with the rules for greenhouse gas inventory reporting, and all parties are going to be able to count that impact against the appropriate Scope 3 category in their own inventories. So the idea of credibility, robust accounting, following the core carbon principles that occur in an offset market also applies in the inset process. The difference is, we're not starting with a registry that has already defined the protocol. We are bringing the protocol forward as fit for an agricultural purpose and asking an organization to verify that. And that becomes really challenging, because there is not a lot of agricultural expertise in the validation and verification bodies that exist. And so there's a big education challenge, and I think what we need to look for is certifiers in this process that have agricultural knowledge if we want to get real action happening in agriculture.
I'm going to ask you a little, sort of like, little side question here. Nutrien has obviously invested significant time and resources into setting all of this up. What advice would you have for other companies in the ag sector if they're just starting?
I think it's really important to think about the value chain intervention approach. And when you're first starting, it's really challenging to get the right quantification science. And so for me, it's starting with known quantification methodologies, and then having that discussion, I guess, with the validation body around what brings the credibility to that science. So that's the starting point. Start with published, peer-reviewed quantification, even if it's regional. Usually what these organizations look for is global science, large bodies of published peer-reviewed data. But we know science for agriculture is very context and site specific. So building your quantification methods using the available science and having a convened group of scientists that supports that quantification method. I think that's an important starting point on the science side. And agronomists, science, I really went down the weeds on the science. This trust and capacity building is also a huge component. So for us in trust building, we had to do trust building within our own agronomists. We had to do trust building with the farm customers that we're working with to explain to them why we're doing carbon quantification projects on their farms. And there's also a capacity building issue. So to really understand what kind of information is required, how do we manage that data coming off the field? What makes data good quality? So I think trust and capacity building, in addition to having a known science quantification method, those are the three key elements.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to move on to you, Katie. So I'm wondering if you can sort of share some lessons learned if they want to establish Scope 3 pathways within their value chain, and what kind of regional differences exist and how to take that into account.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. And I think that Michelle did a fantastic job providing a bit of context and also underscored how complicated it is and also how nascent this space is. I am not just saying this because I'm on stage with Michelle and Nutrien asked me to be here today. I mean, Nutrien is an incredible, incredible leader in this space, but that also takes, a lot of risk taking because there isn't a clear pathway of those who have come before you to do a lot of this work, including the engagement with the farmers and the suppliers. And it is, if you've been in these markets for any amount of time, it is an incredible amount of effort and learning and resources, time, money, quantification, the monitoring, the outreach, the list goes on and on and on. So happy to be here. And the Scope 3 bit it's certainly a tougher nut to crack, but more people at least are paying attention to it and trying to crack that nut. I think it's worthwhile to give maybe context to the group where I come from, International Emissions Trading Association, IETA. That's what we say. Before I started this job, they're like, just remember it as I eat you, IETA. And I was like, what does that mean? And then I started IETA and I was like, oh, now I get it. It's like all consuming. We came out of the UN process about 25 years ago. UNCTAD in particular gave us legs, and it was because market mechanisms were being negotiated under Kyoto. And they needed some business at the table who understood markets in order to actually design it, right, and execute how these market instruments could help with climate targets under Kyoto. Fast forward to Paris Agreement, gavelled through in 2015. So if you ever hear about Article 6, that's our article under the Paris Agreement, and there were some pretty intense negotiations happening down the corridor right now related to Article 6 operationalization, specifically related to methodologies and removals. But looking at, and just for us, it's not really that surprising where we would have, say, 120 to 180 business members for many, many moons. And then over the last 2 years, we've doubled that. We're nearly growing past 350 now. And a lot of that is because corporates have taken on net zero targets. So it's not only they have to come up to speed really, really fast about compliance, carbon pricing, and markets, and they are going to have to be either compliance entities under that space, right, or they have to have investment, project developers. We also represent the assurance providers, the standards. So as Michelle mentioned, CAR, Vera, Gold Standard, IETA members, we're part of the ecosystem in orbit. Yeah, like I was saying, in the last couple of years, just with SBTI as one of many drivers behind corporates taking these incredibly ambitious net zero targets, including covering Scope 3 emissions, there was an awakening, let's say, by some across many sectors and regions that they needed to come up to speed pretty quickly around markets and best practice and how to actually grapple with this. And if you look at SBTI, right, it's a challenge. It's more than a challenge. And it is not as friendly as maybe we would like to see it be related to the use of credits and use. But it doesn't mean that those who are signing on don't have to figure out what their pathways look like and be working with, those upstream and downstream to do some decarbonization and make sure it's outcomes based. So that is what we have seen born in the 20 plus years of the offsets market, the carbon market, right? As Michelle said, around quantification, around monitoring, around verification, around even registries. Those are being transferred, adapted somewhat to this in-setting space. There isn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the tradable commodity component to an in-setting unit yet. We'll see what that asset class could look like, right? Again, super nascent days, but you do have, again, all those key players that are involved in kind of developing these foundational components to the in-setting framework and the accounting that are also linked to their general offsetting space, right, and registries, so that it's a spot to watch, and how these things potentially converge over time will be very, very interesting. And the final bit, just also on agriculture, is that in Alberta, it started its system 2007, long time ago. You had a couple of pockets globally where you had compliance emissions trading systems. Only one that allowed for agriculture offsets to be used for compliance purposes, that was Alberta. So that's why there's so much learning and experience, including on agriculture, compliance offset usage, and just sophisticated players in ag that have come out of the Alberta system, including Nutrien. And then obviously broadly Canada. I don't have to tell you that, Sophie. But it's worth mentioning that because, again, fast forward to 2023, and you have over 70 countries and subnationals around the world that are developing a compliance emissions trading system. The thing is, not a lot of them cover agriculture, right? So it becomes ripe to figure out how do we unlock activity and drive capital into the agriculture space if there isn't a regulated, compliance component to that. So my final bit is just like regularly, South Africa, Latin America, parts of even the US, they're looking to what's been born out of Canada on absolutely 100%, Sophie. What are the experiences there? How can we bring that here? But increasingly, it's also not just on the offset piece, it's also just like the in-setting experience and the tools that underpin this that we can look to.
It sounds, though, that there's still a lot of space to maneuver. So if companies want to get into, the Scope 3 process, and we have a lot of Canadian ag stakeholders in the audience. And so I'm wondering if you can describe for us how is Canada doing generally on Scope 3 emissions in agriculture specifically? And how do we compare it to other countries? So you've explained how other countries perceive us, but where do we sort of situate ourselves exactly?
Well, as I said, I kind of gave a bit of a teaser there for that, but I did provide you, why it's not just Nutrien, but Nutrien is a big, big player, obviously, but it's because a lot of that learnings came out of Alberta, and you had just a sophisticated batch of players, and not just big companies in the food space and the fertilizer space. It was also project developers, right, and farmers, and land and assurance. You talk about the limited supply, extremely limited supply of those who can do the actual assurance, the validation, the verification in ag, which is challenging. Well, you had a lot of it born out of Alberta. And then that, transferred to other parts of Canada. So I'm really not just saying it because there's a lot of Canadian there. It really is one of, not one of, I would say, the top globally that those are looking to replicate, right? Likely not identical because there are different contexts in other regions. And then I will say with the US, and when you had CAR and Vera come on board with actually agriculture voluntary protocols, and so there is a lot of activity that's happening in the US, like that would be the other really key area, certainly more than Europe or other Western groups.
So last but not least, we want to bring in the farmer perspective. Marcelo, I'm wondering if you can just tell us how do farmers insert themselves into the establishment of these processes, and perhaps to set the stage, give us a little bit of the context from Argentina.
Well, thank you. Before answering your question, I would like to point out that although it is true that the number of farmers who record emissions in the field is not massive in countries such as Argentina, there are more and more farmers who are interested in measuring how they are working in terms of emission and identifying what practice they need to apply. For example, they reduce their emissions or capture more carbon in their soils. In fact, two large projects at the national level are led by farmers associations involving more than 2,000 farmers and more than 1.5 million hectares. Having said that and answering your question, there are some issues to keep in mind that limit this process a bit. First, is an issue that has to do with the enormous variability of agriculture system globally that make it difficult to have representative values that the farmers can take to calculate their emissions and capture ultimately the net balance. These are values taken in farming situations or environments that are very different from the local ones. To give a concrete example, a farmer who does no tillage, a very favorable practice in terms of emission compared to tillage in Argentina, must take as a reference to calculate his emission a value generated in tillage system on the other side on the planet. For example, we promote systems that keep fields green for as long as possible, allowing us to store more than 1 meter depth. Therefore, we should be analyzing the carbon capture at sequestration at that level. In other countries in which the production systems are based on tillage, it's reasonable that the measurements are made up to 30 centimeters. These metrics or values do not take into account these models as we have mentioned before. Keep the fields green for as long as possible, with roots live as long as possible also. This explains why farmers must be involved in the whole process. This is not minor because even if farmers do things right, he might punish it with emission values that is not generating and be left out of the market in the face of unexported demands. Also, locally developed emission factors are few. These require science and technology to generate internationally standardized factors. Finally, the farmer is required to ensure that the data reported is robust. For this, they must rely on certification, on traceability tools, digital platforms, satellite imagings, which of course require connectivity, all of which have a cost, not to mention the cost of training. Regarding the latter, there is a key point is that not really makes sense asking a farmer to download a platform or app for data loading created based on calculation methods that he does not know and that are often not applicable to his reality. And that the farmers load just to comply without knowing in depth what he's loading and why without having been trained for this. Farmers to be an active part in the development of this type of platform or calculation tools. Allow me to point that this is not only has the benefit of encouraging the farmers to record his data, but it will certainly lead to better platforms.
Yeah, thank you. Listening to you, it's pretty obvious that you are talking about challenges for producers pretty much around the world. I think that sums it very well. I'm wondering if you can tell us briefly what Agri-food does in support of farmers.
Today, the farmers is faced with exporters that directly stop buying from him if this does not comply with certain reporting and emission levels. But I mentioned it previously, this is not an easy process for the producer, and he has costs that even they pay, it can leave them out of the market because it does not adapt their practice. So I think big challenge is the line to generate initiative for the farmers to feel that his work doing to report their emission and do it well. Today, for example, process is being made in carbon credit for nature management, which recognize the ecosystem service created. This is an example of the progress that can be made with tools of these characteristics of agriculture production, which add value to the farmer. It's important to build a collaborative networking from farm to consumers. In this way, the consumers who can choose what they consume can contribute to scaling sustainable production models. We have to deliver the carbon footprint from cradle to the farm grade in Scope 3 so that the agro-industry can to provide reliable information to the consumers. We need to support farmers. The first step is interchanging information between them and identify some specific issues like carbon footprint, working together with expert technology companies and science to find a better way to do agriculture. This is the way to. We have no the solution. We don't pretend teaching how the farmers need to work. We call it's important for us. The farmers are part of this innovation process in working in network.
Absolutely, I think we couldn't agree more. Okay, well, thank you very much. We will now move on to a little bit of an exercise. So I will read a paragraph and I will ask you for your very quick reaction to this paragraph, 2-minute max. Okay, so there are several critical barriers to enabling credible emission reduction in the ag food value chain, including regulatory uncertainty, insufficient investment in measurement and monitoring of the infrastructure to do so, and a lack of accessible and relevant resources to inform and guide actors. You've just touched on many of these points. So, what, in your opinion, are the critical barriers, and who should lead the initiatives to address these barriers? This could be the private sector, could be government, could be NGOs, but who's the best place to support on barriers? So I'm going to go to Katie first.
All right. Obviously, so multiple answers here, okay, depending on how you want to skin this cat. But I'll bring it back to Canada. There is a massive, massive eagerness. I do not have to tell Michelle this. We finally, after many, many, many years, have carbon pricing from coast to coast to coast, right? And we finally, after over 20 years, over 20, I know because I've been around, a final regulation for a compliance federal offset system. And now we are hyper eager to see which protocols and the shape of those protocols will be released. So there is some indication that the units, reductions and removals that are generated from these protocols can be used for compliance purposes or not, right? But just some clarity. Is it going to be a compliance pathway where we can have some assurance that in 2 years' time or 5 years' time or 10 years' time, that is going to be a unit generated from an agriculture project or activity that could be used for compliance for a price that we know is going to escalate over time? Or not? And if it's not, how are we going to actually do this through more voluntary purposes, right? And that's where, the voluntary market, which plays an absolutely vital role. Yes, we will not get into it. There's going to likely be more and more kind of government intervention regulation around voluntary markets and claims in particular, right? But for the most part, the voluntary, that's why it's called the voluntary, is it's going to be born out of non-government players and leaders in this space. These are the corporates, these are the buyers, these are the standards, right? These are the assurance providers. So it hasn't, this voluntary space around both net zero corporate accounting and the many acronyms, but the integrity initiatives that are front, right, on supply side and demand side around the voluntary carbon market, what you can use or can't use and how you can claim it and not, and what core carbon principles, will be tagged. And so those are, it's still quite convoluted. There's a lot of capital right now that's frozen because they just don't know what the guidance will look like. But I do have faith that through 2024, we're going to get more clarity on this. And it spoke volumes that yesterday people were calling it the VCM day, the Voluntary Carbon Market Day, because it was every hour there was a new announcement, tangible, concrete work related to end-to-end voluntary carbon market integrity framework with a bit more contours on what this space around the VCM looks like. And not just the voluntary space, but also possible convergence elements with the compliance markets down the line. So I don't know, barriers,
Nope. Point taken. So
Thank you, Canadian government. Yeah. No.
I have faith too that we will have clarity. I'm going to go to Marcelo second.
Well, I think we need to create a society that learn in order to a big networking between farmers all over the world, financial companies, agro industry, and trying to identify what add value to the consumers and to the planet. And we need to co-build these indicators, environmental indicators, social indicators, economic and productive indicators. We need to build working together and agree what are these indicators. And the farmers are people of action. If we need to close the gap between the ideas and the researchers' lines and the implementation, we need to conform that societies that learn include farmers. I think this applies for all kind of human activity. We need to include the entrepreneurs, the people who push the action, and we need to work in a push and pull innovation system and networking. For us, this is the most important to advance fast.
Yep. And Michelle, what about barriers?
I think similar to Marcelo, one of the critical barriers is that farms are businesses for profit, and they're very complex businesses. We're asking them to produce yield for a value, and now we're also asking them to consider how do they produce greenhouse gas emission impacts. And I don't think we've been very clear in the value proposition at the farm gate and gaining that kind of understanding with the farm customers about what the practice change costs. And there's all the complexity of greenhouse gas accounting in the background, but to really simplify it, It's we're asking for practice change, and we're not very clear about the return to the farm economically from making a practice change that they're managing their farms already for optimizing their production, for running very efficient and sustainable farms currently. So we're asking them to make another decision on a practice change and taking risk. And I think one of the critical barriers is being able to look at that value of the carbon market or the biodiversity market, and how we as supply chain actors together with governments incentivize that kind of outcome that we want to see. So I think more clarity in the value back to the farm gate is one of the critical barriers. Trust and capacity building. When we're talking with our farm customers who are, very sophisticated in the use of farm data already, and the farm data tools that they already have in place, and we're saying now we have to pivot that information and turn that into units of carbon or units of nature improvement. I think there needs to be that understanding at the farm gate about how do you create that unit of carbon? How do you create that unit of nature? And this is my personal farm data about the productivity on my farm. So how can I trust the use of that data is going to offer me the value and the security of that data? I think that is also a barrier. So this capacity building, trust building is an important component not to be overlooked. And finally, I would say investment in quantification methods. So we know directionally what is the correct action to take to reduce emissions or to increase soil carbon sequestration. But we get caught up in fighting the science around exactly how to measure, and my science is better than your science. And so we need some risk takers in the space who say, we don't have perfect science, but we do accept that directionally you're moving the right way. So while there's all this threat of, being accused of greenwashing, we have to stand together and say, directionally, this is the right thing to do. The science is going to catch up to us eventually, and we'll know if we need to tweak our path this way or that way a little bit. But I don't think that in agriculture we're really well served right now with the science and quantification methods. I think we let the scientists fight with each other a little too much.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're saying essentially we need to de-risk the enterprise for the farmer, but we need to take some risks in how we sort of establish the processes from a scientific standpoint and an accounting standpoint. Oh, yep.
To that, Sophie, I also think leaning into the food security narrative is paramount. I mean, that is, that's really a golden opportunity to get more attention, right? And I also think that it breeds more openness to having public-private partnerships. If you're kind of building this, it's so nascent, you can't just have companies say, okay, we'll take it all on, right? The risk, especially while we're doing the capacity building and the outreach and kind of that engagement. There is a bit of like, if you build it and we feel comfortable, more and more of that private capital will feed in. But we're not there as much as we should be. And over the last few years, given just frankly geopolitics and just where economies are right now, national security and food security, right, and prices, I mean, that is an absolutely core narrative that I think that this entire stakeholder group, right, needs to lean in very heavily on. And so like and the other thing, quickly, border carbon adjustments are coming. Border carbon adjustments are coming. And this kind of work is going to be absolutely fundamental into a future world where you're going to have more and more of these border carbon adjustments where there actually is an explicit price related to the products that are being imported into these regions. And so those who are already knowledgeable and have scaled the curve related to actually the quantification and assuring that their product actually is legitimately low carbon, right? They're going to have a leg up and a competitive edge and also just their suppliers, right? And those so that is, it's just something to be very, very aware of. It's not an academic exercise anymore. This is becoming very real.
Right, with consequences.
I think two dramatic events teach us the science is the solution, the COVID pandemic, for example, and the Russia invasion is also. There are a very fragile balance between supply and demand. We need to support a 40 increase of demand to 2050, and we need to do this with less environmental impact. We need a lot of science, a lot of farmer thinking, a lot of technology companies, working together. It's not easy, the challenge. We need to combine productivity and efficiency. It's very difficult to do alone. The farmer is a activity that is little lonely. The farmers is in the farm, don't share information with other farmers. We need to connect farmers first with technology companies, science, policymakers, and work together. It's not easy to the world the next years. Challenge.
So I'm going to turn to the audience. You've heard a lot of pretty in-depth and rich information on Scope 3 emissions, and I'm wondering if you have any questions, comments.
Hello. Thank you so much. This was really insightful. So you talked a lot about carbon, and I'm wondering about the other greenhouse gases like methane, specifically methane, since that's such a big part of agriculture, like where you see that in what you were discussing with Scope 3 emissions and specifically like accounting and yeah, or even like offsets for methane, just your thoughts on that and where we are now.
I'm happy to start on that if that's okay. And Marcelo, maybe being on the farm, you might also want to speak specifically to that. So in carbon accounting, we talk about carbon all the time, but we're really talking about the Kyoto greenhouse gases, including methane, and we convert everything to a carbon dioxide equivalent. For a crop production company like ourselves, the majority of our emissions are carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. We have very few methane emissions in crop production. The majority of methane emissions in agriculture are related to livestock production. So I'm not able to influence the livestock production on methane emissions so much, but I think it's important that there needs to be a focus on methane emissions because of the global warming potential. And I think that we haven't focused enough on the possibility of reducing methane emissions in the agricultural footprint. It might not be as difficult a path as some of the other greenhouse gases. So I do think it warrants the attention. But Marcelo, I don't know if you have a view on methane in agriculture.
Yes, we believe that in the constant evolution of our knowledge and our productive systems. We start with no-tillage. We have a lot of problems with resistance, and we need to combine this no-tillage with crop rotation using cover crops. And if we use legumes, you could fix biologically nitrogen, for example, and reduce the use of synthetic fertilizers. Not eliminate, of course, reduce. But we need to combine a lot of visions and with an holistic vision. And if we are talking about livestock production, for example, we need to learn a lot about this carbon sequestration of the grasslands and work in the balance between the green gases emission and carbon capture. We need to know more about this. And there are a lot of surface with grassland, and which is the destiny of this surface if we eliminate the beef production, for example. We need to combine the sequestration of carbon, the emissions in agriculture and livestock production, We need to learn more, but we need, I hope, the next COP. I have a lot of information about carbon footprint to show you, and all farmers work in the same way or similar way to compare our information and could interchanging with data. This is a good question. We need to learn more about the system.
I mean, methane's getting a ton of attention, as it should be, at this COP. And I think Michelle did a good job explaining where on methane, and you have to think about it as, yeah, like methane, carbon, it's denominated in carbon, but methane is captured in that, and there are tons of protocols already available out there for methane, not just in the ag sector, but in many other sectors. I've always been, it's quite easy, relatively, easy when it comes to like quantification and the permanence and, compared to some of the other harder, land use type protocols in ag. I mean, not another federal government, there are a couple of methane livestock protocols that are under development right now. Huge opportunity in other places in the world, including in Argentina and across Latin America, for like livestock. And it will be interesting to see when I talked earlier about these global voluntary carbon market integrity initiatives and some guidance around what potential protocols, project types will be labeled first, out of the gates in 2024. It is going to be the easier ones, but with co-benefits, presumably. So it'll be interesting to watch about like the livestock for methane in ag as possible contenders for some of these like earlier out of the gates, like high integrity labeled into the market. The other thing I'll say is ecosystem marketplace. For those of you who've been in this market for a while, know it's like our gospel. So it just published its latest buyer's report last week. Publicly available online. They go quite granular into what are all the project types, nearly all the project types in the world, right? Including on the agriculture space, and then the types of protocols within ag, and there's dozens, right? And what are being used, what prices are they getting, right? What trends are we seeing? So it's really a helpful compendium of information and data related to all project types, not just ag and methane, but.
So, yes, of
Can
course.
I also maybe just build a little bit on what Marcella was saying, because I think it's so important to think about that. I think you're talking about the trade-offs concept. So we do have methane emissions from livestock, but livestock are so critical to the maintenance of grasslands in our agricultural landscapes. And we have direct evidence in Canada, Eastern Canada in particular, when they lost their livestock industry due to mad cow disease and a loss of that livestock industry in Eastern Canada. What happened was the forage ground and the grasslands were converted to annual crops. So we had a loss of that soil carbon sink in the ground when we lost livestock. So while we might have methane emissions from livestock, they have a very important role. So it's never black and white. There's these trade-offs, and we have to think of that whole farming system.
Thank you for helping with the answer.
Thank you for bringing that
Thank you,
idea up.
So I think, anybody else have a very quick question?
It's important to
we have an
talk
intervention.
about carbon sequestration, but also emissions. We need to know how many carbon dioxide equivalent we emit per unit of food or fuel or biofuel produced or biomass. We need to starting to speak with this data, which is our carbon footprint. This is important. Combine, balance, capture and emissions.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated the sort of the interplay between your interventions. I think we got a full portrait, frankly, on this topic. So it's pretty obvious that setting up Scope 3 processes is eminently possible. And so it was fascinating to hear the Nutrien story, and hopefully we see more of those being set up in other companies very soon. the centrality of the producer in being involved in the decision making, being given the tools to actually understand the data collection and the data input, and bringing down barriers, and setting up the the external mechanisms necessary to have the markets in place and be able to profit also from this entire enterprise. So I think the lesson that we take from this is continued collaboration and maybe keeping ourselves informed and ready to spring into action, because there are both opportunities and consequences if we don't set ourselves up rapidly. But on that note, I would like to warmly thank our panel